What did we say the doxology started with last?
Because
Yes.
yes.
Everybody knows that from camp.
That's
Hey,
Grace.
Yeah.
Okay.
We
Well,
talked about the doxology. I brought it so people could know what it was.
oh, the praise
That's
God
what I
from
brought.
all
Oh, yeah,
blessings
praise
from.
God.
Yes. Yeah. This one from
It's from the
1637. Okay.
But you can't keep that because that's from my
I
large
can tell this is a personal copy. I would not do
Well,
such a
it's
thing.
a large. It's actually our green hymnal in large print for one of our
Oh,
members at the time that we had the green hymnal.
right? Oh, nice.
Yeah, so I use those large print ones for the live nativity because it's a little darker in the barn. you
Sure
know,
is.
And,
Yeah.
it's just really nice when they can do this.
Tim?
Can we hear it?
The doxology?
Yeah. I gather it's music that was written in 1637.
Well, the composer for this one was around that time. The actual doxology is much older than that. But that's the one that we kind of sing now. You know, the praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise Him, all creatures here below. Praise Him above, ye heavenly hosts. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost.
That was in the days when we did amens at the end of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
For those watching on the internet, send your contributions.
Promote us
Yeah.
for other churches.
That's right. Okay, we are at our last book of the Bible, the last one written. Of course, the last one in the Hebrew Bible that we see is Malachi. But the one that was actually written last is Daniel. Actually written somewhere, well, written about the year 164 BC. The setting is back in the 500s. Remember, after the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of all the Hebrews, taken off, you know, the story of the three Hebrews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the story of Daniel and the lion's den, all of those things are set in that period. Did it take place? Did the writing of that take place in that period? Absolutely not. We know that the place names and even the use of the Aramaic, which we see in chapters, I think 7 through 12, is kind of shows us the dating of all this, plus the events that are going on at this time. It's the story about a man, Daniel, who was a righteous Jew, a noble Jew even, living in Babylon, and there's elements that look like prophecy, along with eschatology, which is the end times. Eschaton means end. And it is both apocalyptic, cosmic in its viewpoints, and pretty political too. In fact, very political. It addresses the politics of what was going on in the years 167 to 164 BC and the terrible things that were happening at that time. Now, by this time, remember, Cyrus the Great had defeated the Babylonian Empire and had let the first ones go home. A few years later, second wave goes home. They start rebuilding the temple. They start rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. Then yet another group, and then another group. And they go back to Jerusalem, to Judah, and they begin trying to really establish this is who we are. These are our religious laws. These are our cultural statements. This is when the Psalms are compiled. This is when the final editing of the prophets are done. Some kind of last minute additions to certain things. Job, remember the very first one we talked about, Job finally gets his last edition done, the last chapter of Job. Last thing to be written. But now there's not just the Babylonians have been done away with, the Assyrians before them, the Persians are the ones now in control. And the Persians were kind of good to everybody else. They let people have governors from their own land. They didn't bother with people's religions. In fact, Cyrus the Great becomes the first one called the Vad Geshem, a righteous Gentile. This is the first guy that they look at. When they're talking about Gentiles who have helped the Jewish people in their history and in their crises, Cyrus is the first one mentioned. You're not going to find any Pharaoh mentioned. Never. Not going to find too much in the way of the Canaanites mentioned. Certainly not the Assyrians. Lord knows not the Assyrians. But Cyrus, his personality and his strategy being what it was he wanted a happy people. He didn't want slaves. He didn't want just people to be bled dry in taxes. He wanted them to prosper because he was smart enough to know that if they prosper, so does the empire. And so Cyrus becomes the guy who sets all that in motion. Now, he winds up having a son named Cambyses, who doesn't rule for all that long, but I told you the story about him dying in the town of Ecbatana. Remember? Okay, well, I didn't tell you that story. That's a good one. Good one, Ted. So, Cambyses was a bit of a jerk. And so he wanted to be greater than his father ever was. Well, he went to a fortune teller, and the story goes, the fortune teller says, "You will die in Ecbatana." Okay, you do. And he says, "Great. I just won't ever go to Ecbatana then." Because the Persians had basically three capitals. One was in Ecbatana, one was in Susa, and the other one was in Babylon, until they built, or created the capital in Persepolis. Well, he goes off to invade Egypt, and he hears about a rebellion back in his capital, so he jumps on his horse. Well, it's the Egyptian desert, and so the leather scabbard had gotten kind of frail and brittle, and the sword cut through the scabbard, the sheath, and it dug into his leg. And he's bleeding out. And so he's taken into the tent of a guy there, and they're like, "Sire, we can't stop the bleeding. We can't get." So he grabs the old man whose tent he's in, and he goes, "Quick, tell me what's the name of this place." "Well, we loved your father so much, we decided to name our village after your father's capital. Welcome to Ecbatana." So, yep, there he dies. Now, after he's gone, he really leaves no heirs, and nobody really wanted anybody from Cambyses. One of Cyrus's great generals, called Darius, becomes the king, and he really creates a dynasty that will last a good little bit. Darius decides there is some nice land to be had over across the Aegean Sea. I like these people called the Greeks. And he decides to invade Greece. Well, you know about the Battle of Marathon, where the Persian troops land there, and boy, that was a disaster. The Athenians, just the Athenians, not the Spartans, not anybody else, the Athenians defeat them, and of course, this one guy decides to run back home to Athens. Was it 26.2 miles? Is that what it is? Runs back to Athens, shouts out the word Nike, actually Nike, which means victory, and falls dead. Now, why anybody would want to run 26.2 miles after that, just for general purposes, I don't get it. But knowing what happens to the poor messenger afterwards, well, okay. So it was a disaster. Darius is gone, and his son then, Xerxes, becomes next. Well, we know about Xerxes. He's not going to land on ships. He's going to cross the Dardanelles, by making a bridge of boats. And so this whole army marches across, and they, well, let's just see. Yeah, we've got enough of a map to. So they cross at this narrow point, actually it was this one, this narrow point here, and they come across to here. Now, they get to this one place called Thermopylae, where it is this mountain range here, but it is so close to the shore and the cliff that there is a choke point right here. So, it's the time of the festivals, and nobody's supposed to go fight. But the Persian king Leonidas says, we got to stop these guys, and there's only one place that we can do it. So he takes 300 Spartans, becomes the very famous, scenario. But along the way, he picks up some Thessalians, he picks up some Phocians, he picks up some others. I think he's got something like 6,300 troops when he gets there. Well, they pack into that choke point now, and the smart thing is that if they've got, 300 soldiers across, 400, whatever, they can pack it in deep like that, and the Persians can't commit their whole army of, say, 150,000, can't commit the whole army against them. They can only commit an equal number. So for the Spartans, it's always 1-to-1. It's not going to be any kind of 10-to-1 or whatever. Goodness, be more like 20-to-1, I suppose. Anyway, as always happens, somebody decided to go to King Xerxes and say, I know a way around the mountains. Well, he leads them around, and now the Spartans with the others, and actually King Leonidas had told the others, go home, rally the rest of Greece. We'll hold them here as long as we can. There was no way they were going to win. They knew that. They just got to hold them long enough for the rest of Greece to mobilize. So the 300 Spartans make this stand that lasts for 2.5 days, I guess. But eventually the rest of them are all killed. Some great lines in there. The second in command for Leonidas, he was told by a messenger of Xerxes, and he said, we have such archers that our arrows will block out the sun. And he goes, then we will fight in the shade. You gotta like a guy like that. So, sure enough, they held him off long enough. Greece was ready to mobilize, and they fought for several years. Eventually, the combined forces of Greece defeated the Persians, and Xerxes goes home. Doesn't seem to have a plan to come back. But up in Macedonia, which is kind of up here, there's a king named Philip II. And Philip has created this great force, and his whole point is, we will make Persia pay for coming here. Well, somewhere around, 336 BC, Philip is assassinated, or at least dies, and his son, name everybody knows, Alexander the Great, becomes the next king. Well, he spends time mobilizing his forces here, subjugating the Greeks and securing his forces down there, and then begins to march across into Asia Minor. They fight great battles at at Granicus. He marches on and will fight other, those are cross swords. One of the cool things is there was a place called the Gordian Knot, place in Gordian. And this Gordian Knot was so intricately tied that they said nobody could unravel this. So he gets there, he sees this sign that says, whoever shall undo this knot will be the master of Europe. They said, do you think you can do it? Yeah. Draws his sword and hacks through the knot. Okay, they didn't say how it had to be done, but so he goes on now and he fights at the Battle of Issus, and he goes, and finally he's going to meet Darius in head-to-head combat. Darius outnumbers him probably 3-1, but Alexander is a smart cat, and he winds up defeating him at the Battle of Gaugamela, and Darius the Third, actually by this time, takes off and is gone into hiding. One of Darius's generals winds up killing Darius and presents his head to Alexander. And Alexander said, only a king may kill a king. And he has the guy put to death. Well, he winds up going down into Egypt. He winds up taking the city of Tyre. He winds up, well, taking pretty much everything. He goes down into Egypt. Oh, it's actually on the Delta. And establishes a city named Alexandria. He takes the city of Tyre. He takes everything that he might, and it's called, in strategy, they call it the indirect approach. Now, he's wanting to get out here to Babylon and to Susa and to Persepolis, all the rest of them, but he's not going to make a straight march to it. He's going to keep going back and forth so that Darius III doesn't know where he's going to be going next. He winds up just taking everything. He finally conquers Persia. He goes over into India, fights a tremendous battle against King Porus of India at the Indus River, and finally his troops are worn out. They've been gone from home for a long time. I mean, the Battle of Gaugamela was in 333 BC. By the time he's 30, he's taken everything. The great line from the book called The Campaigns of Alexander by Arrian says, and when Alexander surveyed the breadth and length of his empire, he wept, for there were no more worlds to conquer. What a great line. Well, he winds up getting sick, gets some kind of fever, all kinds of ideas about what happened. But he goes home back to Persepolis, where he's actually married the daughter of Darius III, and he says, okay, I'm dying, I'm not going to make it. Here's what I want. I want doctors to carry, the best doctors in the land, to carry my coffin. I want you to spray money out on the road. I want you to carry my body on shields, because I want people to know, doesn't matter how powerful you are, doesn't matter how rich you are, doesn't matter how great your doctors are, when it's time to go, it's time to go. So he dies. Just before he dies, his generals gather around him and they said, to whom do you leave your empire? Alexander. He says, to the strongest. Oh, no. That means they're going to be duking it out for the next how many years. So it finally wound up being kind of an agreement, I guess, after they had fought. In Egypt, the general who took over and established a dynasty was General Ptolemy. Now, it's from Ptolemy. In fact, Ptolemy the 16th, is that right? 16th, is the brother of Cleopatra. Cleopatra is also descended from there. So, not to make any trouble, but when people talk about, well, Cleopatra must have been dark-skinned with dark hair because she's from Egypt, and that's African. And so, she was Greek. All of her family married Greeks. And so the ruling class of Egypt was the Ptolemaic dynasty. Cleopatra, like the rest of them, fair-skinned. In Syria, the rulership is given to this guy named Seleucid. His name was Seleucus, but the dynasty is called the Seleucid dynasty. And you had a general Antipater, a general Cassander, you had several other, General Porus over there, because the guy who had been the king in India that Alexander defeated said, you're the toughest cookie I've faced this whole time. Why don't you sign up? And of course, Porus goes, execution, sign up with that, Alexander. Execution, I'll sign up. So now the Seleucid dynasty is going to rule all of this. Ptolemy his descendants will rule all of that. Now, here's why that's important. Is because Seleucus and his descendants were trying to make some kind of noble gesture to the Jews in Judea, Israel. Now they're starting to call it again. And so they let them worship. They let them have their high priest. They let them have all of that stuff, and it all looks pretty good. But they starts to begin this process of, we call it Hellenization, where Greek becomes the most important language. Greek culture, Greek mythology, and philosophy begins to have an effect. Eventually, we see a general named Antiochus, and Antiochus will, he's pretty corrupt. Antiochus IV is named Antiochus Epiphanes, which means God made manifest. If you're going to give yourself a nickname, make it a good one. So he said that he is Antiochus, God in the flesh. And so he starts to sell off certain positions. The position of high priest, he sells it to the highest bidder, a guy named Jason. Then another guy named Menelaus decides he wants to be high priest, so he pays him even more than Jason did. Well, all right. And so they began to have this corrupt system, but the people began to rebel against all this. Especially a group of brothers known as the Maccabees. The father, Judas Maccabeus, he was called, began this revolt against Antiochus. And it especially happened because they decided to have a specific ritual on the altar of the temple where they sacrificed pigs. Well, we know what we know about Judaism, and you're not allowed to not only sacrifice pigs, you're not allowed to eat them. And he sacrifices all these pigs on the high altar. When we hear the phrase abomination of desolation, that's what it's talking about. This abomination that is just desolating the purity of the temple. Jesus makes reference to the abomination of desolation. Well, he's quoting Daniel. This act where a foreign power, a foreign government has now trampled on the religious rights of the people. Jesus is talking about that with the Romans too, because the Romans are going to destroy the second temple. Anyway, we start hearing in Daniel about the anointed one who has been removed. Well, he's not talking about the Messiah. He's not talking about anything. He's talking about when the high priest, Onias III, had been removed from his position, and that position had been given to the highest bidder. That's what's being talked about there. The book of Daniel is talking about what's going on right now during their time period. All right? With that in mind, we can begin. So, the book of Daniel, I think I left something out. So the message of the whole book is that just as the God of Israel protected Daniel from Nebuchadnezzar, from all the rest of them like that, so will the God of Israel protect Israel from its political enemies at the same time, from what's going on right there. Now, the thing is that Daniel knows he can't name Antiochus. Not Daniel, but the author of Daniel. The author of Daniel is like, now just get me in all kinds of trouble. So he actually sets it in the past to make it look like he's talking about the future, but he's actually talking about the time that he's in right there at that moment. Now, the book of Daniel gets included among the Ketuvim, the writings, and in our Christian Bible, we list it among the major prophets. In the Apocrypha, we see additions to Daniel. There's the prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three Holy Children. Azariah is Shadrach. And when we're reading it, Azariah is the Hebrew name for Shadrach. And then there's Susanna, and then the last one is Bel and the Dragon. All those were added on to the book of Daniel at a later point. Look at the book of Daniel, and we've got two distinct sections that are there, but then they wind up breaking up a little bit too. The first one is what's going on in the court of the king. You know, you got the statue that everybody's supposed to worship. You got all those things that are going on. That all takes place in the first 6 chapters. Chapters 7 through 12 is the apocalyptic visions. Now, I know we've talked about apocalyptic literature before, but let's remind ourselves that it comes from the Greek word apokalypsos, that just means a drawing aside, like pulling aside a curtain. And so what the book of Daniel is talking about is there are angelic forces who are fighting on our behalf. Especially you think about when Gabriel is wanting to come to Daniel with a message, and he said, I was trying to get to you, but I was resisted by the prince of Persia. That's reference to a demon. And he said, I finally had to go back and get Michael, whose name means who is like God. I don't know if that's ends with a sentence or with a question mark. Either one of them works. But Daniel refers to Michael as the captain of your armies, talking about that this is the patron angel of Israel. And he says that Michael came, made a way, and I was able finally to get to you. So Michael becomes this is the first time we see Michael in biblical literature, that
How
this
is
is
it spelled?
just like all the Michaels we know, Michael. El meaning God, Micha is who is like, and so who is like God. Now, in some folks, I think it's the Jehovah's Witnesses who have said that Michael is in fact Jesus. Not so much. Because Michael is one of those created beings, one of those who stands in the Lord's army, is accounted as an archangel and a commander of the host. And of course, when you get to the book of Revelation, then you see Michael with the enviable tasks of throwing Satan out of heaven, throwing the dragon out of heaven. So Michael is always the one who is seen to come to the rescue. In some Jewish literature, Michael is the one who escorts the righteous dead up to paradise, but Michael always has this great role. To this day, I think he's the patron saint of police officers and soldiers, I think, maybe, something like that. Yeah, when you're in trouble, that's the guy. And then we have some of the chapters, like chapter 1 and then chapters 8 through 12, are written in Hebrew, but chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic. Kind of makes a big deal. And that almost got Daniel left out of the Hebrew Bible, because they wanted the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, to be nothing but Hebrew. There's a lot of Aramaic here. But they wanted Daniel because of the comfort it gave for people under oppression. I mean, goodness gracious, during the time when the Bible was being canonized, the Hebrew Bible, by the Jewish Council, in the year 90, man, they're in trouble. The Romans are just beating their brains out. So they are looking forward to some kind of heavenly deliverance afforded them by Michael. Well, the division that we have here winds up having this, we call it a chiastic arrangement in the Aramaic section. In chapters 1 through 6, we see this kind of a chronological arrangement where we see the shift from Babylonian rule to the rule by the Medes, and then from Babylon to Persia in chapter 7 through 12. Now, when we use that word chiastic, a chiasm is simply a block arrangement of this where the core of the story is surrounded by different elements. Kind of looks like, well, I think I might, did I write it? I did. Like you have a section here, followed by a second section, and then you have this core element, and then it kind of goes backwards. Kind of like a ABBA. It's an artificial kind of thing because they were using it to show what is the core of the whole story. And that's in the Aramaic version. They've tried to, a lot of scholars have tried to describe that this section doesn't really work with the others. This is kind of a choppy arrangement of the book there, but because of the language, because of the writing style, it really does hold the book together nicely. I mean, when you read Daniel start to finish, you don't really look at it and go, this doesn't follow, this doesn't flow. It follows beautifully. But we have this move from what's happening in the court to what's happening in the heavenlies. Angels and stuff like that. And then there's that great phrase in, what is it, chapter 9, I think, when it talks about that on the throne sat an ancient one, and fire poured from his presence and pooled around him. Well, that's the lake of fire. It is the presence of God, where it's not a thing where people are tormented. It's not a thing of torture. This is the very presence of God, where all the things that bothered us, all the things that slowed us down, all of our own selfishnesses and all that, when we enter into the presence of God, that's where we are finally, once and for all, purified. That begins with Daniel. John in Revelation will use that phrase over and over again. And he's always thinking about Daniel when he does it. So, I gave you a little, didn't come out too good. But anyway, part 1 and part 2 of the arrangement there. So, you see the introduction there. The introduction says it's in Babylon, it's written in Hebrew, and then we've got Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We've got the fiery furnace, the one we all know. We have Belshazzar's feast. Remember that one when he's got the finger writing on the wall? Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Says, it actually means bread and bread all taken away. Yeah. Now, it winds up being translated in our Bible something like, tonight your soul is required of you. Oh, all right. About the same thing. But anyway, in this story, it actually talks about the fall of Babylon to Cyrus the Great. Now, here's another momentary pause. In one of the coolest campaigns of the ancient world, Babylon was, okay, up here, there is the Euphrates River, and Babylon straddles the river. So, the wall looked like this, and the river is flowing this way. Well, they had a little arch with, iron grate, and the water flowed through the city and then out the other side. Well, Cyrus has a guy who goes, I know how to get in there. The wall was supposed to be so big that you could have chariot races around the top of the wall. And this guy says, I can get you in there. And Cyrus is like, I don't see how. He goes, sure. What we'll do is just divert the river far enough upstream, they won't know it's coming. And so he goes, all right. So when the water is diverted from the Euphrates and just goes around, that here, all of a sudden, this becomes a dry bed and soldiers walk underneath. So Belshazzar, who's actually the crown prince, not really the king, but anyway, he's having this feast, sees this on the wall, and all of a sudden, coming under the walls are loads and loads of Persian soldiers. He's killed off, the royal family is killed off, and Cyrus now takes over Babylon. And of course, the first thing he does is seal up that hole. Let's just get rid of that so nobody thinks to do that again. So now Cyrus, that story is told there in Daniel, and we start to see this righteous king coming along. Begins to start letting people go. Well, then you got poor Daniel having to deal with Darius, not Cyrus. And Darius is the one who winds up putting him in the lion's den. All right. He gets through all that, and then it kind of, Darius kind of has a change of heart. Well, all of that is talking for sure about this is what happened with the Persians. The Persians wound up being on our side. They weren't, I mean, Cyrus was, but then the ones after kind of had to be brought along. Then, in part 2, you wind up seeing the beast from the sea. All right. John will use the same imagery like that, of this beast coming out of the sea. Well, what he's talking about is the arrival of the Romans. Because when the, what's his name? Antiochus. When Antiochus decides to launch an attack against the Egyptians, it's the Romans who show up to defend Egypt. And that begins their cooperation with each other. Egypt becomes a protectorate of the Roman Republic at that time. And in trade, Egypt sends grain and, of course, beer. It wins friends and enemies, wins friends over and convinces enemies. So anyway, so when that beast from the sea, it's talking about the Romans now become a world power. You see the vision of the ram and the he-goat. You see the interpretation of Jeremiah's prophecy about the 70 weeks. The angel comes and talks about the kings of the north and the kings of the south. And of course, he's talking about in the kings of the south, talking about the Egyptians. The north, well, that's going to be the Romans. And the two of them are going to be all over each other. So these visions in chapters 7 through 12 is that very crisis that I was talking about. That took place in Judea from 167 to 164 when Antiochus IV threatened to destroy Judah's, or I should say Jewish worship in Jerusalem. Now, he had come to the throne in 175. And everything kind of, like I said, looked good. The people were happy with the Seleucid dynasty. They were happy with these Greeks. But the high priestly family starts to split. And like I said, you had Onias III, who was the high priest at the time, but one of his own family members, Jason, goes and bribes Antiochus, gets made high priest. It was a boatload of money. Well, Jason also wants Jerusalem to be declared a polis, that is, a Greek city. No longer just a protectorate, but actually a Greek city where Greek language, Greek politics, all of that has the final sway. Now, that also meant that, like Greece being democratic, that Jerusalem is going to be democratic. That they would be able to, all the citizens would be able to vote. And it also meant that, boy, oh boy, kind of like being a Roman citizen had all of its great benefits, so is it with the Greeks, that being a Greek citizen brought you all kinds of possibilities, business and everything. So Jason figures it won't be just everybody's automatically a citizen. They gotta buy it. Who are they gonna buy it from? Well, from Jason, of course. Again, John Coltrane said, nice work if you can get it. And so Jason is going to be the one to sell that off. Now, none of that was really bothersome to Judaism at all. And all these reforms, everybody liked them. Especially, of course, the wealthy of Jerusalem. They really liked that a whole lot. And it gave them a feeling of being kind of cosmopolitan. You know, we're no longer these country bumpkins. We're sophisticated folks. We are like the Greeks. Sure. 3 years later, Jason is tossed out by, like I mentioned, the other priest, Menelaus, who simply went to Antiochus and said, how much did he pay you? I'll give you $1 more. And so off goes Jason. Gives him a bigger chunk of money. Now, again, Antiochus had tried to invade Egypt. In fact, he tried it twice. And in 169, he was marginally successful. But on the second time, in 168, the Romans, like I said, showed up and chased him out of there. But now, Jason has heard a rumor that Antiochus has died in Egypt. So he's like, this is great. I'm going to go and knock off this guy Menelaus, and I'm taking over all over again. Didn't quite work that way. Antiochus gets there, drives Jason out of Jerusalem, chases him out, and then ransacks the temple. He takes all the gold out of there. He plunders the place, and also now is really trying to get rid of Jewish religion and making everything Greek. He prohibited the book of the law, the Torah. And then on December 15th, 167, he committed the abomination of desolation, sacrificing all those pigs on the altar. And it wasn't a one-time deal. This was a thing he kept doing to continually humiliate the Jewish people. And now, Jewish religion is really under threat. But Judas Maccabeus and his boys decided to rebel against all that. Thing is, Daniel is very, very accurate in his description. The book is being written by an eyewitness to the events. He describes it perfectly. The thing is that when you look at, like the Book of Lamentations or 2 Kings, which talks about the destruction of Jerusalem, you see sometimes they don't always get the facts right. That's not a criticism, because what we now know is that it's called the psychology of trauma, that people don't remember exactly. That's why forensics is a better testimony in a court of law than someone who suffered a thing, because they think about the impact on them. They don't think about objective data. Well, with the writer of Daniel, however, he gets it right. He is remarkably accurate. And now you wind up having the Maccabee brothers show up, and took a while, but remember they had been cut off, and they were running out of oil, and so in the menorah it keeps burning. It's supposed to run out, and yet the flame of the candle keeps burning there in the temple. That's where we get the Festival of Lights, Hanukkah. It's commemorating this event when the oil didn't run out. It kept the flames burning there. It was a sign to them that God was still looking after them, was still pleased with their religion. Even though Antiochus had tried to destroy the religion, God is on their side. Well, that was 8 days that lasted. The oil should have burned out in one night, but 8 days it lasts, and so that's why Hanukkah lasts for the 8 days that it does. Put it on speakerphone, let all.
So the
Yeah, the
Maccabees
Bible
won.
study can make all
They
that.
did. The
You know
Maccabees
what,
sure
I
did.
knew this story for a long time, I never knew the end of it.
Yep, yep.
I thought they were still in a cave someplace.
They were for a while, there's no doubt about it.
Debbie,
But they defeated Antiochus. They took back the temple, of course. They were wildly successful. It worked very well for a little while. And then came the Romans. And that's just a whole other ballgame. Now, so the crisis that is talked about in Daniel is that desolation of the altar, desecration of the altar. It used to be that there were sacrifices there evening and morning, twice a day. And so you see that phrase evening and morning repeated several times in the description there through the chapters. Because they're talking about these are the sacrifices that we're missing now. This should be going on, but it's not. But in Daniel, Antiochus is still alive, and so Daniel begins to talk about this war that's going to happen between the Syrians and the Egyptians, which never actually took place, which gives us a good indication that this is written before the death of Antiochus, because Daniel is saying these things are the things that are going to happen. He doesn't know how Antiochus dies. He thinks that Antiochus is going to die in Palestine, but he didn't. He died in Persia, actually running for it. He was trying to, find help from some of the other of the Greek nobles. So the book is finished before the death of Antiochus, but not much before. We know that he dies in December of 164. Or at least that's when Jerusalem finds out about it. The period that's being discussed, consensus is 167 to 163, and it's certainly not later than 163. Because even though Antiochus died in December of 164, again, the news may not have reached them for a good long time. But so that becomes the end date when it could have been, was 163. It's a remarkable book. It is a remarkable book. It was, when I was a kid, I used to just sometimes stop and go read the section about, well, who doesn't like to hear about an angel coming to the rescue of another angel to defeat a demon so that he can go and tell him your prayers have been answered? That's just good stuff. And then some of it was pretty scary to a little kid, but all of it, even not understanding anything about it at all, just being a good story, behind it all, God was always coming to the rescue. That no matter what the people had done, no matter what they may have deserved or not deserved, God was not going to abandon them, and there were angels on their side. How cool is that? I mean, so to a 8-year-old kid, no matter what kind of trouble I got in, well, not so much at home, because you're just going to get a bug whipping at home, that's all there is to it. But no matter what happens to you on the playground or the baseball field or something like that, God is on our side. There are angelic forces who will support us. And no matter how scary things may be with other things that you hear about or read, God's gonna get an answer to you someday. It's a wonderful book. And that really is the whole purpose of apocalyptic literature, is to tell us we're not alone. We're not in this by ourselves. God will fight on our behalf and has angelic beings who will be there to defend us. That'll get you through a lot. And even again, as a little kid, that was a great source of comfort to me. And as I got older and older, it actually came to mean even more than it did before. That's where they close it out. Daniel is, again, because of the writing in Aramaic as well as Hebrew, some of the Jewish scholars weren't too happy about it. But for the Christians of the first century, man, we loved it. This is telling us exactly what we want to hear, because the Christians are also under persecution in the first century. It's not just the Jews, the Christians are taking it on the chin too. And so to be able to hear that God is on our side and will support us and rescue us, pull us out of fiery furnaces, reward us for not bowing down to idols, it was the thing we needed to hear. Because at the end of the first century, along comes this Roman emperor named Domitian, who demanded that everyone call him Deus et Dominus Noster, our Lord and God. And Christians were like, can't do it. Just can't do it. Well, if you don't, then there'll be trouble. Well, there'll be trouble. And what should be the most, and still to this day to me, one of the most meaningful passages out of Daniel is when they're about to be thrown into this furnace. What did the three Hebrew sons say except, we know our God is able to rescue us. But even if he doesn't, we'll still praise him. Even if, how many times have we said that? How many times have we, a friend of mine who's been a friend of mine since I was 15 years old, he just called me the day before yesterday. His daughter, this charming girl who has loved God all of her life, was found out to have cancer. And she said, what is she, 40, I guess? Maybe less. But anyway, he said, what do I tell her? I said, you tell her that God is able to rescue her. But even if he doesn't, he's still worthy of praise. And he went, well, that's kind of what I told her. And I said, you know, we don't know. I said, but I know this, that no matter what happens, everything God does is out of mercy. And who knows what would happen otherwise? God's merciful. God's loving. That doesn't mean, and I told him this, and I actually sent her a letter. I said, oh, when we see God, he's got a lot of explaining to do.
Yeah.
But then we'll know. Will it make sense? Maybe not. But I'm going to have questions. But kind of like, you know, and I'm sure I must have told you this before, that at Auschwitz, as people are just being horrified, I mean, the rabbis decided to put God on trial. And at the conclusion, they said that God was guilty for letting this happen to him. And then they concluded it by saying, and now it's time for evening prayers. We got our questions. We have accusations against God. How could you let this happen? But in the end, no matter what, God is still worthy of our prayers and our praise. Daniel would have told us that, and did.
Yeah,
That's
God is good
all the time.
all the time.
That's right. Pat?
No,
I just sit on.
no,
amen.
God is not good all the time. The reason they were in Babylon, the reason the Babylonians smacked the crap out of everybody is because our God wanted it so. It made it happen.
I kind of reject that.
Well, that's what the Bible says. You know, I mean,
Well, sure. The Bible also says that the trees of the field shall clap their hands.
well, I mean, the reason the reason Nebuchadnezzar was beating everybody to death and smashing everybody to death is because the Lord wanted that to happen.
Well, you can say that if you want to.
Well, it's
I
what
think
the
that
Bible
human
says.
nature is human nature. Well, yeah, and the Bible is written out of human nature.
Well,
Because the people are going to be people, and God's going to let
I
them.
mean, he's not always so nice, because they transgressed, because they transgressed, in fact, when Israel was coming out of Egypt, and they did the little golden calf nonsense, he said he wanted the Lord, right, the God of Moses,
Mhm.
right?
I don't necessarily.
Said he
think-
wanted to get rid of him.
I don't
Okay?
necessarily think he wanted it to happen. He allowed it to happen.
Well, it happened, but then as a result of it happening, the God of Moses, the guy that Moses was talking to said, "Leave me alone, I'll get rid of him." You know, and that's definitely in the Bible. That's
Yeah, but if you had been here for those classes, you would have found out that that was written after the fact, and it was their way of saying, this is how we got in this spot. Is this must have happened this way, because here we are, how did we get here? And this was their explanation for it. Is it historical? Absolutely not. Is it legendary, and does it help to explain their situation in the world? That was their whole
and the
point.
idea is it true? I mean, can you offend him and suffer death or destruction because of it? And that's the truth. If you can offend our God, the God of Israel, he can be offended, and he can destroy you. You know.
I don't think so.
I don't either. I
We
mean,
do a good enough job of destroying ourselves.
Well, yeah, human nature is human nature too, and that's why you say, why do bad things happen to good people? Because we're not, otherwise it would be preordained and we wouldn't have a life, we wouldn't have
Exactly.
choices.
We would be puppets.
Yeah,
And who wants that?
no, I mean, that's why when they say, why does God allow the tsunami or a hurricane or whatever it is? Those things happen. If we allow the planet to be destroyed, that's on us, not on God.
Yeah.
Well, is Sodom and Gomorrah reality, or is that fiction as well? Yeah. I mean, did that happen?
There is no evidence that supports the idea, except there was a volcano in that area that may have done that.
Well, I mean, is the story as it's written in the book of Genesis, is it true or not?
It's true, but it may not be historical.
Well, according to the story, and it's quite a story, it's one of my favorite stories, I love it, but there was an argument or a discussion between the Lord and Abraham as to Abraham wanted to spare Sodom.
Hmm? Because of his cousin Lot.
It came down to like an argument of how many righteous people were there,
Mm-hmm.
and apparently it didn't. There weren't that many, weren't enough. Lot was taken away. His wife was turned into a pillar of salt because she looked back, and it's the most. I think it's the most fantastic story, but it's an example of the wrath of God, is it not? I mean, he destroyed everybody, men, women, and children, turned into smoke,
Well-
ashes, cremated.
We only see from one side, though.
Well, that's what it says, though. That's what the Bible says.
I don't care.
Well, I care because this is my Bible.
Well, sure.
It's my God.
It's mine too, and mine too.
It's the God I pray to. It's the God
Sure.
I hope. And I know he can be offended. He can be offended.
Yeah, but I also know that God is agape, that God is love. All the other statements are relative statements about God can be just, God can be angry, God can be all that. But these are all people trying to put on God human attributes because that's all we understand. But when John tells us The nature of God is agape. And that's all that it is. That's got to mean something. So when we look in 1 Corinthians 13, the so-called hymn to agape, it's a description of what agape is. But if we know that agape is God, then that description also is a description of God. And what does it tell us? God is patient. God is kind. God does not insist on his own way. Sometimes he just lets us do our thing and we pay the price.
What,
I don't think
what
God-
about the flood? Okay, did that happen? Is that fiction?
There was a flood, we know that.
Well, what about Noah's Ark?
We don't know.
Well, so what's in the Bible isn't true?
No, it doesn't have to be historically accurate for it to be true, because the stories that it is telling us, those are true.
Well, I mean, when
Principles
Paul
are true.
talks about the Noah's Ark, and most certainly did, in his writings, is he like just being a juvenile, or? I mean, he speaks of it as being reality, doesn't he? You know, so many people were saved. It was like, in other words, only a few were saved, right? The rest of the people apparently were destroyed.
So everybody else on the planet was destroyed.
No, I don't know if it says everybody on the planet was destroyed, but it was certainly there was massive destruction of life. I mean, the ark basically was like a boat. It floated and landed, and when it settled, it landed on top of a mountain. You know, so there was a lot of water everywhere, and especially where Noah was with his boat. The whole world is rather large. I think the Chinese might have survived it. You know,
What we know to be mostly true is that that area, southwestern Asia, it underwent a flood. We know that. Was it a global flood? Well, no. But to them, it was the whole world, because everything they saw was underwater. So they thought, that was their interpretation of it, was that the whole world was underwater. It wasn't. But it also gave us the story then. But the point of it all isn't to say this thing happened exactly this way. The point of the scriptures is for us to look at what they thought God had done for them. They didn't blame God for the Babylonians or the Assyrians. No, they always say, we did wrong, we did not take care of people, and this was the inevitable conclusion of us being fallen people. It wasn't that God was sending anybody, although they want to interpret it that way, especially the book of Habakkuk says, that, well, God's sending the Chaldeans because of our sin. It was a matter, Jesus would call it the law of sowing and reaping. You sow what you reap. Or they can call it karma if they want to. We did these things, and it caused these things to happen back to us. When you treat people awfully, when you treat people with disrespect, that's what you're going to reap. You're going to get that back. And that's the history of it. But again, the history of the Hebrew Bible is especially made clear in the book of Hosea, where he says, every time we fall away, God comes and buys us back. Every time we sin, God comes and brings us back. There may be some bad consequences, but it's just consequences. I'll never forget one time when a young couple came to me in church one time and they said, we need to confess. Oh, Lord, that's the last thing I want, but okay. And so they were talking about they had had premarital sex. Is God going to forgive us? Yeah, God will forgive you. Yeah, of course. You ask forgiveness, God forgives you. Okay. Well, sometime they came back and they said, she's pregnant. Okay. You said God was going to forgive us.
There's
God forgives
consequences.
you, but there's consequences.
Are you ready?
We are
Maybe
ready.
that's a blessing too.
Well, yes, absolutely right. That couple is still married to this day, and that was 40 years ago.
Yeah.
So, yes,
That child was a blessing.
if child was a blessing. Oh, here you go, Beth. Sorry.
Oh, yes. Isn't that bad?
Will not
I
be
could sing it
called
sometime, and I don't have it. I looked
That's right.
I looked and I read him though, and
Well,
I
it
don't
would be
know where to put
nice too. That's another thing we could do at the fourth service is have the actual liturgy.
Oh,
The musical liturgy.
Oh, if you're wanting me to sing that stuff, you're gonna change gods. You're gonna,
I was to church with my cousin's daughter last fall.